Harrison Sterling thought he had won. The ink on the divorce papers wasn't even dry when he looked at his wife of 3 years and called her a financial burden. He laughed, tossing her a check for $5,000. Pity money, he called it, mocking her plain clothes and her silence. He thought he was discarding a dead weight to climb the corporate ladder, but Harrison made a fatal calculation. He didn't know that the burden he just divorced wasn't a poor orphan. She was Isabella Vane, the sole heiress to the Vane Consortium, the very shadow bank funding his entire company. And that check he threw at her? She was about to use it to buy his destruction. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room on the 42nd floor of the Sterling & Cumbers building in downtown Chicago. Inside, the air was frigid, conditioned to a sterile chill that matched the atmosphere around the mahogany table. Harrison Sterling sat with his back to the view, looking every inch the rising tech mogul he believed himself to be. His suit was a bespoke charcoal grey from Savile Row, his watch a Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars. Across from him sat Isabella. She looked small in the oversized leather chair. She wore a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days, and no jewelry other than the thin gold band on her ring finger. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, revealing a face that was pale and tired. "Just sign it, Bella," Harrison said, checking his watch again. "I have a dinner reservation at a Billionaire in an hour. Don't make me late." Isabella didn't reach for the pen immediately. She looked at the papers, then up at him. Her eyes, usually warm and accommodating, were unreadable. "Are you sure this is what you want, Harrison? There is no going back after this." Harrison scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished wood. "What I want? Bella, look at you. Then look at me. We haven't been on the same planet for 2 years. You're stagnant. You're happy couponing and watching rerun sitcoms while I'm trying to take Sterling & Codes public. You don't fit the image anymore. You're an anchor, and I need to fly." "I supported you when you were working out of a garage, Harrison," she said softly. "I paid the rent. I bought the groceries when we had nothing." "And I'm paying you back," Harrison interrupted, sliding a check across the table. $5,000. That covers your little contribution with interest. Consider it a severance package." The lawyer, a man named Preston Calloway, who had the moral backbone of a jellyfish, smirked from the corner. "It's a generous offer, Mrs. Sterling, given you signed a prenup waiving rights to the company assets. You'd be wise to take the check and the divorce." Isabella looked at the check. $5,000. It was an insult. It was a slap in the face. But Harrison didn't see the flicker of amusement that danced deep in her eyes. He only saw submission. She picked up the Mont Blanc pen. The scratching sound it made against the paper was the only noise in the room. Isabella Vane. She signed her maiden name. Harrison frowned. "You signed Vane. Whatever, as long as it's legal." "It's legal," Isabella said, standing up. She didn't take the check. "You forgot your money," Harrison taunted, flicking the piece of paper toward her. "You'll need it. Rent in the city isn't cheap for a librarian." Isabella paused. She reached into her worn tote bag and pulled out a set of keys, the keys to the modest penthouse they shared. She placed them gently on the table. "I won't need the money, Harrison, and I won't need the apartment. I hope Tiffany likes the view." Harrison froze. He hadn't mentioned Tiffany. "How did you—" "I've known for 6 months," Isabella said, her voice devoid of the tears he expected. "I was waiting to see if you'd be a man and tell me. But you're not a man, Harrison. You're just a suit filled with ambition and hot air." She turned to the door. "Walk away," Harrison shouted, his ego bruised. "Walk away and see how far you get without the sterling name." Isabella opened the door. The noise of the busy office filtered in. She looked back one last time. "The sterling name was worthless until I polished it, Harrison. Remember that when the tarnish comes back." She walked out. As the elevator doors closed, Harrison let out a breath of relief. He felt lighter. He was free. He grabbed his phone and dialed Tiffany. "It's done," he said, grinning. "The dead weight is gone. Let's celebrate." Down on the street, the rain was pouring. Isabella stepped out of the building. She didn't open an umbrella. Instead, a sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the curb, cutting through the taxi line. A chauffeur in full uniform stepped out, holding a large black umbrella, shielding her instantly from the downpour. "Miss Vane," the chauffeur said, opening the rear door. "Your father is waiting for you on the airstrip. The jet is fueled for Zurich." Isabella slid into the plush leather interior, stripping off the cheap cardigan to reveal a silk blouse underneath that cost more than Harrison's entire wardrobe. "Thank you, Godfrey," she said, her voice changing. The timidity was gone, replaced by the steel of a woman raised to rule empires. "Get me my phone, the encrypted one." "Yes, Ma'am." She took the device and dialed a number. "Daddy, it's done." He signed. No, he didn't know. "Yes, you can initiate protocol blackout on Sterling and Coders immediately. Let's see how well he swims when the water rises." 3 weeks had passed since the divorce was finalized. Harrison Sterling was on top of the world, or at least he felt like he was. He stood on the balcony of his new penthouse, paid for by company loans, clinking champagne glasses with Tiffany. Tiffany was everything Isabella wasn't. She was loud, she was obsessed with labels, and she hung on Harrison's every word as long as his credit card was black. She was a model-turned-influencer who didn't know the difference between a balance sheet and a bedsheet. But she looked good on his arm at galas. "To us!" Tiffany squealed, the diamond on her finger catching the city lights. "And to the IPO! We're going to be billionaires, Harry." "Trillionaires, babe," Harrison corrected, intoxicated by his own hype. "The IPO launches next week. The investors are lined up around the block." His phone buzzed. It was Preston Calloway, his lawyer. "Not now, Preston. I'm celebrating." Harrison laughed into the phone. "Harrison, shut up and listen." Preston's voice was shaking. That was new. Preston never shook. He only slithered. "Have you checked the pre-market reports?" "No, why?" "We lost the anchor investor." Harrison nearly dropped his glass. "What?" "Which one?" "The Obsidian Group. They pulled out. All $400 million. Gone. And because they pulled out, the two smaller venture capital firms are getting cold feet. They have a clause that ties their investment to Obsidian's participation." "That's impossible," Harrison roared, causing Tiffany to jump. "Obsidian has been with us since the seed round. They can't just pull out a week before the IPO." "They can," Preston whispered. "I'm looking at the contract. There was a change of marital status clause hidden in the sub-addendum of the morality bylaws." "A what?" Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. "A morality clause, Harrison. It states that if the CEO undergoes a divorce that is deemed acrimonious or publicly damaging without the board's prior approval, Obsidian reserves the right to liquidate their position to protect their brand integrity." "That is insane. Who reads that deep into the fine print?" "Apparently they do. Harrison, without that $400 million, the bank is going to call in the bridge loans. You leverage the company assets to buy the new headquarters and, well, your penthouse." Harrison hung up. He felt sick. He looked at Tiffany, who was busy taking a selfie with the skyline. "Everything okay, babe?" she asked, not looking up from her screen. "Fine," he lied. Just a hiccup. He needed to fix this. He needed to find out who was behind the Obsidian Group. They were a shadow firm. Nobody knew who the actual CEO was. It was just a board of faceless directors. The next morning, Harrison stormed into his office. The mood was apocalyptic. People were running around with papers. Phones were ringing off the hooks. Mr. Sterling, his secretary, a terrified young woman named Sarah, cried out, "The bank is on line 1. The suppliers on line 2 say our credit line has been frozen." "Get me a meeting with Obsidian," Harrison barked, ignoring the calls. "Get their representative on the phone. Now." I tried, sir. They sent a courier." Sarah handed him a thick, black envelope. It was heavy, made of cardstock that felt like velvet. Embossed on the front was a silver crest, a hawk gripping a serpent. Harrison tore it open. Inside was a single card with a location and a time. The Vane Estate Private Club. 12 Benoit, p.m. Today. Attire, formal. Do not be late. The Vane Estate? Harrison frowned. He had heard of them, of course. Everyone in high finance had. They were the old money that made the new billionaires look like paupers. They owned shipping lines, rare earth mines, pharmaceutical patents, and vast swathes of real estate in Europe. They were trillionaires, the kind who didn't appear on Forbes lists because they owned the people who wrote the lists. Why would the Vane Estate be interested in him? Unless they were the ones pulling the strings behind Obsidian. Hope surged in his chest. If he could pitch to the Vane family, if he could charm them, he wouldn't just save his IPO, he would be catapulted into a stratosphere of wealth he hadn't even dreamed of. "Cancel my schedule," Harrison ordered, adjusting his tie. "And get the car. I'm going to meet the money." He didn't know he was walking into a lion's den. The Vane Estate Private Club was located in a historic mansion on the Gold Coast, a building that looked like it had been transported brick by brick from 19th century London. There was no signage. You either knew where it was, or you didn't belong there. Harrison arrived at 11:55 a.m. He was sweated through his shirt, but his jacket hid it. He walked up the marble steps, giving his name to the stone-faced doorman. "Mr. Sterling," the doorman said, not checking a list. "You are expected in the solarium." Harrison walked through the heavy oak doors. The interior smelled of old books, beeswax, and power. He was led down a long corridor lined with oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors. Finally, the butler opened a set of glass doors leading to a greenhouse-style room filled with exotic orchids. In the center of the room, a woman sat at a white wrought-iron table, sipping tea. Her back was to him. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed power, and a wide-brimmed hat. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was familiar, but polished, sharper than he remembered. "Please, sit." Harrison sat, putting on his best charming smile. "Madam, it is an honor. I assume you represent the Vane interests. I'm here to clear up this misunderstanding with Obsidian." "It's no misunderstanding, Harrison," the woman said. She turned around. Harrison's smile froze. His brain short-circuited. He blinked, thinking the stress was causing hallucinations. It was Isabella. But it wasn't the Isabella he knew. This woman had diamonds in her ears that were worth more than his company. Her hair was styled in sleek, glossy waves. Her makeup was flawless, accentuating eyes that looked at him with icy amusement. "Bella," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What? What are you doing here? Did you get a job as an assistant?" Isabella laughed. It wasn't the soft chuckle of his wife. It was the laugh of a queen looking at a jester. "Oh, Harrison," she said, picking up a porcelain cup. "You really are dense. I don't work for the Vane Estate. I am the Vane Estate." Harrison stared at the woman he had shared a bed with for 3 years. His mind scrambled to find a logical explanation, rejecting the reality in front of him. "This is a joke," Harrison stammered, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. "Is this some kind of actor's gig? Did you spend that $5,000 hiring this venue to spite me? You're pathetic, Bella." Isabella didn't flinch. She simply gestured to the butler standing in the shadows. "Tea, please, Alfred. And perhaps something stronger for Mr. Sterling. He looks like he's about to faint." "I am not fainting," Harrison shouted, his voice echoing in the large, glass-walled room. "I know who you are. Your dad is a mechanic in Ohio. I met him. He had grease under his fingernails and drove a beat-up Ford truck." "My father," Isabella corrected calmly, setting her teacup down with a soft clink, "is Arthur Vane. His hobby is restoring vintage 1960s Mustangs. You met him once, for 10 minutes at our wedding. You were too busy networking with your fraternity brothers to speak to him. You saw grease on his hands and assumed he was poor. You saw his truck, a 1955 F-100 worth more than your first apartment, and assumed he was lower class. You assumed, Harrison. That has always been your fatal flaw. You only see what you want to see." Harrison felt the room spinning. He remembered that day. He had brushed off the old man in the flannel shirt, embarrassed to introduce him to his investors. "But the money," Harrison rasped. "You clipped coupons. You worried about the electric bill. Why?" Isabella stood up and walked toward a large easel covered by a velvet cloth near the orchids. "Because I wanted to know if a man could love me, Isabella, the person." "Not Isabella, the walking bank account," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "When I met you, you were hungry. You were passionate. I thought we were building something together. I didn't intervene with my family's money because I wanted you to have the pride of self-made success. I paid the bills with my librarian salary, which was actually the dividends from a single trust fund, so you could reinvest every penny into Sterling and Co." She ripped the velvet cloth off the easel. Underneath was a blown-up image of the check Harrison had thrown at her. The check for $5,000. It was framed in gold. "And this," Isabella said, pointing to the image, "this was your valuation of my love. $5,000. You called it pity money." Harrison swallowed hard. "Bella, look. People say things in the heat of the moment. We can fix this. If this is real, think of what we can do. The Vane Consortium and Sterling Tech. We'd rule the market." He stepped toward her, reaching for her hand. The old charm, the salesman's smile, flickered back onto his face. "I made a mistake. I was stressed about the IPO. Tiffany, she means nothing. She's just a distraction. You're my wife." Isabella took a step back, her expression turning from cool to disgusted. "I was your wife, Harrison. I signed the papers, remember? You were in such a rush to get to dinner." She snapped her fingers. 2 men in dark suits materialized from the hallway. They weren't butlers, they were security, and they looked like they carved statues for breakfast. "The meeting is over," Isabella said, turning her back to him to admire an orchid. "Oh, and regarding Obsidian pulling their funding, that wasn't me being vindictive. That was automatic. But what happens next? That is me." "What happens next?" Harrison asked, fear creeping back into his voice as the security guard stepped closer. "You have a loan payment due on Monday for the new headquarters," Isabella said casually. $40 million. Since Obsidian pulled out, the bank, Vanguard National, has invoked the acceleration clause. They want the full amount, immediately. "I can't pay that." "I know," Isabella said. "And guess who owns Vanguard National?" She looked over her shoulder, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "Get out of my house, Harrison, before I have you thrown out." The guards grabbed Harrison by the arms. He struggled, shouting, "You can't do this! I'm Harrison Sterling. I'm a CEO." They dragged him down the long corridor, past the portraits of the ancestors who seemed to glare at him with disdain. They hauled him through the heavy oak doors and threw him, literally threw him, down the front steps of the mansion. He landed hard on the pavement, scuffing his expensive Italian shoes and tearing the knee of his suit trousers. The heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that shook his bones. Harrison lay there for a moment, the rain starting to drizzle again. He looked up at the imposing mansion. He had held a winning lottery ticket in his hand for 3 years, and he had thrown it away for $5,000 and a model who couldn't spell entrepreneur. His phone buzzed. It was Tiffany. "Harry, where are you? The credit card was declined at lunch. It was so embarrassing." Harrison screamed and threw his phone into the gutter. The downfall of Harrison Sterling didn't happen in the shadows. It happened under the blinding lights of the flashbulbs. 5 days after the meeting at the Vane estate, the annual Global Tech Innovators Gala was held at the St. Regis in New York City. This was the event of the season. Every CEO, investor, and tech journalist was there. Harrison had decided to brave it. He was desperate. He had spent the last 4 days trying to secure emergency funding, but every door was slammed in his face. His reputation was radioactive. Rumors were swirling that Sterling & Co. was insolvent. His only hope was to land a white knight investor at the gala. He needed to look successful. Appearance was everything. He arrived in a rented limousine. His company car had been repossessed that morning. He wore a new tuxedo, put on credit. On his arm was Tiffany, wearing a dress that was too bright, too tight, and entirely inappropriate for the somber elegance of the event. "Smile," Harrison hissed at her as they stepped onto the red carpet, "and stop checking Instagram." "But people are saying mean things in the comments, Harry," Tiffany whined. "They're saying you're broke." "Shut up," he snapped. As they walked down the carpet, the photographers were oddly quiet. Usually, they would shout his name. "Harrison! Over here!" Today they lowered their cameras. A few whispered and pointed. Harrison felt the sweat trickling down his back. He entered the ballroom. It was packed with the elite. He spotted Jonathan Pierce, a rival CEO he had often lunched with. "Jonathan!" Harrison called out, walking over with his hand extended. "Great to see you. We should talk about that merger idea we discussed last quarter." Jonathan Pierce looked at Harrison's hand, then up at his face. He didn't shake it. He took a sip of his martini and stepped back. "I don't think that's a good idea, Harrison. I don't do business with dead men walking." Jonathan turned and walked away. Harrison stood there, hand suspended in the air. The humiliation burned his cheeks. Suddenly, the room went quiet. The murmur of conversation died down instantly. The jazz band stopped playing. All eyes turned to the grand staircase at the entrance of the ballroom. A woman was descending. It was Isabella. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her figure and trailed behind her like royal robes. Around her neck was the Vane sapphire, a stone so famous it had its own Wikipedia page. Her hair was swept up, revealing the long, elegant line of her neck. She wasn't alone. On her arm was Alexander Thorne, a European banking tycoon known for being the most eligible and ruthless bachelor in the world. "Is that—" Tiffany squinted. "Is that your ex-wife? Why does she look expensive?" Harrison couldn't speak. He felt like he was choking. Isabella reached the bottom of the stairs. The press, who had been allowed inside for the opening remarks, went into a frenzy. Flashes popped like strobe lights. "Miss Vane! Miss Vane, over here. Is it true you're taking over the board of Obsidian? Miss Vane, a comment on the Sterling acquisition? Isabella smiled, a radiant, camera-ready smile Harrison had never seen. She walked to the podium at the front of the room. The host of the gala, the mayor of New York, stepped aside respectfully. "Good evening," Isabella said. Her voice was amplified, clear and commanding. "Thank you for the warm welcome. It has been a long time since I stepped into the public eye. I have been occupied with a personal project that unfortunately yielded a poor return on investment." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Harrison wished the floor would open up and swallow him. "However," Isabella continued, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto Harrison, "the Vane Consortium believes in cleaning up messes, which is why I am pleased to announce that as of 5 p.m. today, Vane Capital has acquired the outstanding debt of Sterling & Co." Harrison's knees buckled. He grabbed a waiter's arm to steady himself. She owned his debt. She owned him. "We will be restructuring the company," Isabella said, her voice hard as diamond. "The technology is promising. The leadership, however, is obsolete. Effective immediately, the board is dissolving the position of CEO." The room gasped. She was firing him, publicly, at a black tie gala. "We thank the former management for their efforts," Isabella said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "Now please enjoy the evening." The applause was deafening. It was an applause for power. Harrison stood frozen. Tiffany looked at him, then at Isabella, then back at him. The calculation in her eyes was visible. "You're fired?" Tiffany asked shrilly. "Like, you have no job? It's a hostile takeover, Tiffany. I can sue." Harrison lied desperately. "You have no money," Tiffany said, her voice rising. "You told me you were a trillionaire. You told me you were going to buy me a yacht. Lower your voice." "No," Tiffany shoved him. "You're a fraud. I wasted 6 months on you." She pulled the diamond engagement ring off her finger. "And this is probably fake, too." She threw the ring at his face. It bounced off his forehead and skittered across the floor. Tiffany stormed off toward the bar, likely to find a new target. Harrison was left alone in the center of the ballroom. A circle of empty space had formed around him, as if poverty was contagious. He looked up at the podium. Isabella was stepping down, Alexander Thorne offering her his hand. She looked at Harrison one last time. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked at him with absolute indifference. She whispered something to Alexander, who laughed. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing into the VIP section, where Harrison was not allowed. Harrison bent down to pick up the ring. As he scrambled on the floor, a photographer leaned down and snapped a photo. Click. That picture, Harrison Sterling on his knees, grasping for a rejected ring, while his ex-wife ascended to the throne, would be on the cover of every tabloid by morning. Harrison Sterling was now living in a Motel 6 on the outskirts of Jersey City. The fall had been swift and brutal. The Rolls-Royce was gone, replaced by bus tickets. The bespoke suits were sold to consignment shops to pay for legal fees. But Harrison wasn't done. He was fueled by a toxic mix of rage and entitlement. He sat on the lumpy mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper, while Preston Calloway paced the small room. Preston was the only lawyer willing to take the case, mostly because he was as desperate as Harrison, having lost his reputation by association. "We have a case, Harrison," Preston said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "It's a Hail Mary, but it's a case. It's called fraud by omission." "Explain it to me like I'm 5, Preston," Harrison snapped, cracking open a cheap beer. "She hid her assets," Preston said, his eyes gleaming with greedy desperation. When you signed that divorce settlement, she didn't disclose she was the heir to the Vane fortune. That is a material omission. If we can prove she intentionally deceived you to secure an unfair settlement, a judge could overturn the divorce decree. You could be entitled to half of her marital assets. Half of the Vane fortune? Harrison sat up. That's trillions. Trillions, Preston nodded. Or at least a settlement in the billions to make us go away. They won't want the bad press. They'll settle. Harrison smiled for the first time in weeks. It was a jagged, ugly smile. She thinks she can humiliate me. I made her. I gave her a life. She owes me. They filed the lawsuit the next day. Sterling vs. Vane. The media storm was instantaneous. The audacity of the suit was breathtaking. A man who divorced his wife for being poor was now suing her for being rich. The tabloids called him the shameless Sterling. But Harrison didn't care. He just needed one judge to listen. The court date was set remarkably fast. Isabella's legal team hadn't tried to delay. In fact, they had expedited the process. Harrison took this as a sign of weakness. They wanted it over with quickly. They were scared. They're going to offer a settlement on the steps of the courthouse, Harrison predicted, as he adjusted his cheap, off-the-rack tie in the motel mirror. Watch. They'll offer $50 million. Should I take it? We ask for 100, Preston said, his hands shaking as he packed his briefcase. But when they arrived at the New York Supreme Court, there were no settlement offers. There was only a sea of cameras and a phalanx of security guards. Isabella arrived in a black SUV. She didn't look at the cameras. She walked up the steps with the grace of a queen walking to a coronation. She wore a black suit that was sharp enough to cut glass. Harrison walked in behind her, head held high, ignoring the boos from the crowd. Let them boo, he thought. I'll be laughing all the way to the bank. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The judge, an older woman named Justice Harrow, looked over her spectacles at Harrison with undisguised distaste. Mr. Calloway, Justice Harrow said, you may present your opening argument. And I warn you, given the nature of this filing, you better have something substantial. Preston stood up. He was sweating profusely. Your Honor, we are here to rectify a gross injustice. My client, Mr. Sterling, was induced into signing a divorce settlement under false pretenses. The defendant, Miss Vane, deliberately concealed her status as a billionaire heiress. Had Mr. Sterling known of these assets, the division of property would have been drastically different. She played the role of a pauper to defraud him of his marital rights. Harrison nodded solemnly. It sounded good. It sounded like he was the victim. Then, it was the defense's turn. Isabella didn't use a lawyer for her opening statement. She stood up herself. Your Honor, Isabella said, her voice cool and steady. Mr. Sterling claims he was deceived. He claims he did not know who I was. I intend to prove that not only did he have the opportunity to know, but that his ignorance was a choice born of arrogance and neglect. And furthermore, I intend to prove that he signed away his rights, not out of ignorance, but out of malice. She turned to look at Harrison. He didn't want my money, Your Honor. He wanted to buy his freedom for $5,000, and now he finds the price of freedom has gone up. The trial lasted 3 days. It was a massacre. Preston Calloway fumbled through witness testimonies. He tried to call character witnesses for Harrison, but nobody showed up. Not his old frat brothers, not his former business partners, and certainly not Tiffany. Isabella's team, led by a shark of a lawyer named Silas Thorne, Alexander's brother, dismantled Harrison's life piece by piece. They showed emails where Harrison mocked Isabella's thriftiness. They showed credit card statements of his affairs. But the final blow came on the third day. Isabella took the stand. Preston Calloway approached her, trying to look intimidating. "Miss Vane, isn't it true that you never told Mr. Sterling about your trust fund?" "I tried," Isabella said calmly. "On our first anniversary, I tried to give him a file containing my financial disclosures. He told me to put the bills in the drawer and went to watch a football game. But you never explicitly said, 'I am a billionaire,'" Preston pressed. "I didn't think I had to," Isabella replied. "We were married. What was mine was his. He never asked. He never cared to look beyond the surface." "No further questions," Preston said, sensing he was losing the room. Silas Thorne stood up for the redirect. He held a document in his hand. It was an old, yellowing piece of paper. "Miss Vane," Silas said, "Mr. Sterling claims he is entitled to half your assets because the divorce settlement is invalid. However, is there another document that governs the distribution of assets in your marriage?" "Yes," Isabella said. "The prenuptial agreement." Harrison scoffed from his table. "We never signed a prenup. I refused. I told her I didn't want to protect my debt." Silas walked over to Harrison's table and dropped the document in front of him. "Mr. Sterling," Silas said, "do you recognize this signature?" Harrison looked. It was his signature. Dated 3 years ago, the morning of their wedding. I remember this," Harrison stammered. "Isabella brought me some papers while I was hungover. She said it was for the marriage license filing. I just signed it to get her out of the room." "Read Clause 4, Section B," Silas commanded. Harrison squinted at the fine print. "Clause 4, Section B. The undersigned, Harrison Sterling, hereby waives all rights to any assets, present or future, held by the Vane Family Trust, the Vane Consortium, or Isabella Vane personally. In exchange, the undersigned agrees that in the event of a divorce initiated by him, he shall pay Isabella Vane a sum equal to 100% of his current net worth as a penalty for dissolution, unless the dissolution is due to infidelity by Isabella Vane." Harrison stopped breathing. The room went silent. "You signed a reverse prenup, Mr. Sterling," Silas said, his voice booming. "Isabella's father insisted on it. He knew you were a gold digger before you even knew she had gold. He wanted to protect his daughter. But Isabella, being kind, never enforced it. She let you live. She let you build your company." Silas turned to the judge. "However, since Mr. Sterling has decided to reopen the settlement and contest the divorce terms, we are now countersuing to enforce the original prenuptial agreement." Harrison looked at Preston. "What does that mean?" Preston was white as a sheet. It means if they win, you don't just get nothing. You owe her everything you have, and everything you ever will have." "But I have nothing," Harrison screamed, standing up. "I'm broke." "Not quite," Isabella said from the stand. She looked at him with pity. "You have your name. You have your future earnings. You have your intellectual property. According to that contract, Harrison, you belong to me until the debt is paid. And since the penalty is 100% of your net worth at the time of filing, and you valued yourself at $2 billion in your IPO prospectus," she let the number hang in the air, "you owe the Vane estate $2 billion. Harrison fell back into his chair. It wasn't just a defeat. It was enslavement. He had sued for half her fortune, and in doing so, he had triggered a trap set 3 years ago by a father who knew exactly what kind of man Harrison was. Justice Harrow banged her gavel. "The court finds in favor of the defendant, Isabella Vane. The plaintiff's motion is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court upholds the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Mr. Sterling, you are hereby ordered to pay the counterclaimant the sum of $2 billion. Until such debt is satisfied, your wages, assets, and future business ventures are subject to immediate garnishment." Harrison stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights buzzed like flies. He had thrown $5,000 at her to mock her. Now he owed her $2 billion. The irony tasted like ash in his mouth. The fall of Harrison Sterling did not happen with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating whimper. When the gavel struck the wooden block in Justice Harrow's courtroom, it sounded less like a judgment and more like the cracking of a foundation. The silence that followed was absolute. Harrison sat in the leather chair, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned the color of old bone. $2 billion. It was a number so large it felt abstract, like the distance to the sun. But the reality of it arrived within 24 hours. The first thing to go was the penthouse. The seizure order was executed at 8:00 a.m. the following morning. Harrison was still in his silk pajamas, staring blankly at the Nespresso machine when the marshals arrived. They were efficient, professional, and entirely lacking in sympathy. "We need you to vacate the premises, Mr. Sterling," the lead officer said, handing him a clipboard. "Personal items only, clothing and toiletries. Anything of significant value, watches, jewelry, electronics, art, is now the property of the court-appointed trustee for the Vane estate." Harrison watched as they tagged his furniture. They tagged the grand piano he didn't know how to play. They tagged the 85-inch television. They even tagged his espresso machine. "This is insane," Harrison whispered, his voice raspy from a sleepless night. "I bought that watch with my first bonus." "And you signed a contract pledging your net worth," the officer replied without looking up. "Please pack your bag, sir." He left the building with 2 suitcases. It was raining again, a cold, biting drizzle that soaked through his coat. The doorman, a man named Henry, whom Harrison had ignored for 3 years, watched him struggle with the luggage. Henry didn't offer to help. He simply held the door open, his face impassive. Harrison hailed a taxi, but when he tried to pay with his platinum Amex, the machine beeped a harsh red error code. Declined. He tried his debit card. Declined. He tried his corporate card. Card not active. The driver glared at him in the rearview mirror. "You got cash, buddy, or are you wasting my time?" Harrison dug into his pocket and found a crumpled $20 bill. It was the only liquidity he had left in the world. He had the driver drop him off at a subway station. He couldn't afford the ride to a hotel. 6 months later, the winter in Chicago had settled in with a cruelty that felt personal. Harrison Sterling no longer existed. The man who swiped a time card at the North Side Fulfillment Center was just a number. Employee 8490. He lived in a basement studio apartment in a neighborhood where the police sirens were the nightly lullaby. The apartment smelled permanently of damp concrete and mildew. There was one small window, located at street level, which offered a spectacular view of passing boots and tires. His day began at 4:30 a.m. He would wake up, his back screaming in protest. The mattress he slept on was a second-hand futon he had dragged off the curb 3 blocks away. He would eat a piece of dry toast, drink instant coffee that tasted like battery acid, and put on his uniform. The uniform was a grey polo shirt with a logo stitched on the chest. Vane Logistics. The irony was not lost on him. It was a daily torture, a psychological branding. Isabella didn't just take his money, she had absorbed his entire industry. Sterling & Co. had been dismantled, its useful parts integrated into the Vane conglomerate, its redundant parts, like Harrison, discarded. But he couldn't get a job anywhere else. His name was poison. A Google search of Harrison Sterling brought up pages of humiliation. The viral photos of him, begging on the floor at the gala, the court transcripts, the articles titled, "The Man Who Divorced a Trillionaire." No reputable company would hire a man known for such colossal arrogance and fraud. So he worked for her, indirectly, invisibly. He was a cog in the machine he used to think he was too good to even oil. Harrison took the bus to the fulfillment center, a massive, sprawling warehouse that covered 4 city blocks. It was a labyrinth of conveyor belts, robotic arms, and towering shelves stacked with goods. "Move it, Sterling," the floor supervisor barked. His name was Gary, a man with a thick neck and a clipboard who seemed to derive immense pleasure from ordering around a former CEO. "Trucks are backed up in Bay 4. We're behind schedule on the European shipments." "I'm going, Gary," Harrison muttered, pulling on his heavy work gloves. His job was high-volume sorting. It involved lifting 50-pound crates off a pallet, scanning them, and placing them onto a conveyor belt. It was mindless, back-breaking labor. At the end of every week, Harrison received his pay stub. He earned $18 an hour. For a 40-hour week, that was $720, but the deposit into his bank account was only $180. There was a line-item deduction on every single pay stub, printed in bold, indifferent ink. Garnishment, judgment, JAR 44492B, Vane Estate. 75% of his wages, every week, for the rest of his life. He had done the math once, sitting on the edge of his futon with a calculator he found in a junk drawer. At this rate of repayment, paying off the $2 billion judgment would take him approximately 23,000 years. It wasn't about the money anymore. Isabella didn't need his $540 a week. The Vane estate made that amount every millisecond in interest alone. It was about the message. It was a reminder that actions have consequences, and some stains never wash out. One Tuesday in November, the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted. The usual cacophony of shouting and machinery dampened into a nervous hum. Managers were running around in a panic, tucking in their shirts, checking safety protocols and sweeping floors that were already clean. "Listen up," Gary shouted, gathering the sorting team near the break room. "Corporate is doing a site walk today. The board of directors is inspecting the new automation integration. I want everyone looking sharp. No headphones, no sitting down, no screwing up. If you look like a slob, you're fired. Got it?" Harrison felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Corporate. He kept his head down, focusing intently on the crates of microchips in front of him. "Just keep working," he told himself. "She won't be here. She has people for this. She's probably in Paris or Tokyo. But luck, as Harrison had learned, was not a renewable resource." Around 10:20 a.m., the heavy steel doors of the main entrance rolled up. A gust of cold wind blew in, followed by a phalanx of people in suits. Harrison recognized the security detail first. They were the same stone-faced men who had thrown him out of the mansion. Then came the executives, men and women holding tablets, looking serious and important. And then, in the center of the orbit, was the sun. Isabella Vane walked onto the warehouse floor. She looked different than the woman he had divorced. The weariness was gone. The hunch in her shoulders from carrying the weight of his criticism was gone. She stood tall, wearing a tailored cream-colored wool coat over a dark turtleneck. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional ponytail. She wasn't wearing aggressive jewelry or trying to prove anything. She simply radiated a quiet, absolute authority. Harrison tried to shrink behind a stack of pallets. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked down at his dirty work boots, his frayed grey shirt, his calloused hands. He felt a wave of shame so hot it made him dizzy. He could hear her voice carrying over the hum of the conveyor belts. "The throughput in this sector has increased by 15% since the acquisition," Isabella was saying. Her voice was calm, knowledgeable. But I'm concerned about the ergonomic data for the workers on Line C. Are we rotating the shifts frequently enough to prevent repetitive strain injuries? We are looking into that, Ms. Vane, a nervous executive stammered. Don't look into it. Fix it, she said firmly. We don't build profits on broken backs. Implement the new rotation schedule by Monday. Harrison closed his eyes. She was advocating for the workers. She was advocating for him, and she didn't even know it. When they were married, he had often bragged about cutting employee benefits to boost margins. He had called it trimming the fat. She had always looked uncomfortable when he said that. Now he knew why. Isabella, look at this. A male voice spoke from beside her. It wasn't a subordinate. It was an equal. Harrison peeked through the gap in the pallets. Standing next to Isabella was a man. He was tall, with messy brown hair and glasses that sat crooked on his nose. He wore a simple parka and jeans, standing in stark contrast to the suits around him. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a high school history teacher. This was Dr. Adrian Cross. Harrison had read about him in the newspapers he scavenged from trash cans. Adrian was a pediatric neurosurgeon who ran a non-profit network of clinics for uninsured children. He wasn't old money. He wasn't a shark. He was just good. Isabella turned to Adrian, her face softening in a way Harrison had never seen. It wasn't the look of a woman trying to please a husband. It was the look of a woman who felt safe. The logistics here could be adapted for the medical supply drops in the Sudan, Adrian said, pointing to the sorting drones. If we scaled down the crates, we could double the antibiotic delivery speed. I was thinking the same thing, Isabella smiled, slipping her hand into his. I'll have the engineering team draw up a prototype for you. Consider it done. She squeezed his hand. He kissed her temple, right there in front of the board of directors, in front of the workers, in front of God and everyone. Harrison felt a physical ache in his chest. It wasn't jealousy. Jealousy implies you think you still have a right to something. This was grief. It was the agonizing realization that he had held a diamond in his hands and treated it like a piece of glass, only to watch someone else pick it up and put it in a crown where it belonged. The group began to move down the main aisle. They were heading straight toward Bay 4, straight toward Harrison. Move! His brain screamed. Run to the bathroom, fake a seizure, anything. But his legs wouldn't work. He was frozen. Isabella and her entourage stopped 10 feet away from him to inspect a labeling machine. Harrison stood there, holding a scanner gun, trembling. Isabella turned. Her eyes swept over the line of workers. She looked at Gary. She looked at the woman next to Harrison. And then her gaze landed on him. Time stopped. The noise of the warehouse faded into a white static. Harrison stopped breathing. He waited for the recognition. He waited for the spark of anger, the smirk of triumph, the whisper to her security guards to have him removed. He waited for her to point at him and say to her fiancé, "Look, that's the loser I used to be married to." He braced himself for the impact, but Isabella's eyes simply slid past him. There was no pause, no widening of the pupils, no flicker of emotion. She looked at his face, saw nothing of interest, and continued scanning the room. To her, he was just part of the background. He was just a texture in the tapestry of her empire. He was as insignificant as the cardboard boxes he stacked. She turned back to Adrian. "We're done here. Let's go get lunch. I know a taco place near here that you'll love." "Tacos?" Adrian laughed. "The heiress wants street tacos?" "The heiress wants hot sauce," she teased. They walked away, arm in arm, laughing. The executives trailed behind them like ducklings. Harrison stood alone in the aisle. The scanner gun slipped from his sweaty palm and clattered onto the concrete floor. She hadn't ignored him to be cruel. She hadn't ignored him to make a point. She had ignored him because he truly, deeply, no longer mattered. He wasn't a villain in her story anymore. He wasn't even a footnote. He was deleted text. "Hey, Sterling!" Gary's voice shattered the trance. "Pick up that scanner. You break it, you buy it. And you can't afford it." Harrison bent down slowly. His knees popped. He picked up the plastic tool. He looked at the retreating figure of his ex-wife, now just a silhouette against the bright light of the open bay doors. The snow was swirling outside, white and clean. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the soft, worn paper he kept there. The photocopy of the $5,000 check. He pulled it out. It was tattered, the ink fading along the creases. Pay to the order of Isabella Vane. $5,000. Memo. Pity money. He looked at the check, then at the empty doorway where she had vanished. "You won," Harrison whispered to the empty air. But he knew that wasn't true. To win, you have to be playing a game. Isabella wasn't playing. She was just living. He walked over to the large industrial trash can at the end of the aisle. He held the piece of paper over the dark abyss. For a moment, he hesitated. It was the last link to the man he used to be. Then, he let go. The paper fluttered down, landing on top of a pile of discarded packing foam and coffee grounds. "Sterling, get back on the line." Harrison turned around. "I'm coming," he said. He stepped back up to the conveyor belt. A new crate slid in front of him. He grabbed it, the weight heavy in his arms, and heaved it onto the stack. Scan. Stack. Repeat. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the city, burying the ambition, and burying the man named Harrison Sterling, until there was nothing left but the work. And that, my friends, is the end of Harrison Sterling. He spent his entire life trying to climb a ladder, only to realize too late that he had leaned it against the wrong wall. It is a terrifying ending, isn't it? Not because he died or went to jail, but because he became irrelevant. The woman he mocked, the woman he treated as a burden, walked right past him and didn't even see him. That is the ultimate revenge. Not anger, not hatred, but indifference. Isabella is out there changing the world and loving a good man, while Harrison is trapped in a cage of his own making, paying a tax on his arrogance for the rest of his life. He kept a $5,000 check as a trophy, and it cost him $2 billion. It's a brutal reminder that when you undervalue the people who love you, you are actually devaluing yourself. I want to know what you think about this ending. Did Harrison deserve to be completely ignored? Or would it have been better if Isabella had confronted him one last time? Is the silence of indifference the loudest punishment of all? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love seeing your theories. If this story hit you in the feels, or if you just enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please hit that like button. It helps the channel so much. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Next week, we have a story about a neglected husband who discovers his wife is actually the leader of a massive underground syndicate. You do not want to miss it. Thanks for watching. Stay humble. And remember, the person you push aside today might be the person you answer to tomorrow. 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 Answer to tomorrow.